You expect me to believe someone your size can handle a real threat? You'd be a liability. The words, laced with condescending amusement, echoed across the sterile training floor. The crowd of young, eager soldiers chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between the towering figure of Sergeant Major Rex Thorne and the compact, unassuming woman he had singled out. Specialist Anya Sharma stood motionless, her posture a study in perfect balance, her expression a blank canvas. She did not flinch. She did not argue. Her silence was a deep, placid lake in the middle of his storm of arrogance. She simply adjusted her weight, a minute shift from the balls of her feet to her heels, her gaze fixed not on his mocking face, but on the polished floor mat where the lesson was supposed to happen. But the real lesson had not yet begun. Watching from the back, near the bleachers, Colonel Eva Rostova saw it. It wasn't in Sharma's file, which listed her as a simple administrative clerk. It was in her stance, the way her hands were held, relaxed but ready, fingers slightly curled. It was a posture of coiled potential, a stillness that wasn't passive but predatory. Rostova recognized the quiet lethality she had seen only once before, in the hardened operators of the 75th Ranger Regiment. If you believe true strength isn't measured in inches, type competence below. Thorne, basking in the attention of the trainees, continued his lecture, using Sharma as his prop. He was a mountain of a man, a product of old-school doctrine where size and brute force were the primary currencies of combat. He explained the physics of leverage, or rather, his flawed interpretation of it, emphasizing how a larger, stronger opponent held every conceivable advantage in a close-quarters engagement. "Look here," he boomed, grabbing a blue rubber training knife and pressing the dull tip against Sharma's throat. "From this position, she has no options. My reach, my weight, my strength, it's simple math. She is neutralized." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper for effect. "This is what happens when you make assumptions about your own capabilities. You end up a statistic." The young soldiers nodded, absorbing the lesson. They saw a man over 6 feet tall and 250 pounds of muscle pinning a woman who barely cleared 5'4". They saw the logic in his words, the simple, visual proof. What they didn't see was the subtle drop in Sharma's center of gravity, the almost imperceptible tensing of her core, or the way her eyes traced the line of his extended arm, not as a threat, but as a pathway. They saw a victim. The colonel saw a fuse being lit. The air hung thick with anticipation and Thorne's suffocating ego. He applied a bit more pressure to the training knife, ready to dismiss Sharma and move on. "Any questions?" he asked the room, a smirk playing on his lips. It was in that exact moment, the split second of his self-satisfaction, that the lesson truly began. There was no warning, no wasted motion. It was a blur of pure, devastating efficiency. Sharma's left hand, moving with the speed of a striking snake, shot up not to block the knife, but to cup the back of Thorne's elbow. Simultaneously, her right hand clamped down on his wrist. It wasn't a contest of strength, it was an exercise in biomechanics. She didn't push, she redirected. Using his own forward momentum against him, she pivoted on her left foot, pulling his arm across her body while dropping her weight. The laws of physics, which he had so arrogantly invoked, now turned on him with merciless precision. Thorne, expecting resistance, found none. He found only a void where his balance used to be, and then a shocking, searing pain as his wrist was locked and his entire frame was torqued downwards in a perfect, spiraling takedown. He hit the mat with a heavy, surprised grunt that knocked the wind from his lungs. The entire sequence, from her first touch to his impact with the floor, took less than a second. It was over before anyone had fully processed that it had even started. And then came the silence. A profound, deafening silence that swallowed the echoes of Thorne's condescending lecture. The nervous laughter was gone, replaced by a sea of wide, unblinking eyes and slack jaws. The trainees stood frozen, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed. On the mat, the tableau was a complete inversion of the one from moments before. Specialist Sharma was now kneeling calmly over the sergeant major, her knee pressed firmly into his back, her control absolute. In her steady hand, she held the blue rubber knife, its tip resting gently against the thick column of his own throat. Her breathing was even, her face impassive. She hadn't broken a sweat. Thorne, pinned and humbled, could only manage a choked, incredulous whisper that barely carried across the silent room. How? How did you do that? It wasn't a question seeking an answer, but an admission of utter, comprehensive defeat. Colonel Rostova walked onto the training floor, her polished boots making quiet, deliberate sounds that broke the spell of stunned silence. She didn't glance at the humiliated sergeant major on the mat. Her eyes were fixed on Sharma. She walked a slow circle around them, examining the hold, the perfect application of leverage, the calm control. "The Viper's coil," Rostova said, her voice clear and authoritative. A transition from a centerline block to a reverse wrist lock takedown. It's a signature technique, taught almost exclusively to direct action elements within the 75th Ranger Regiment. She stopped in front of Sharma and looked her directly in the eye. It wasn't an accusation, it was a confirmation. "Your records say you push paper at battalion admin, specialist. But your body tells a different story. What was your unit?" Sharma, still maintaining the pin, didn't hesitate. Her voice was quiet, respectful, and stripped of all emotion. 75th Ranger Regiment, ma'am. 2nd Battalion, Special Troops. Deployed, the last word hung in the air. A simple statement that carried the weight of 4 combat tours, dozens of high-threat missions, and a world of experience Thorne couldn't begin to comprehend. Rostova nodded slowly, a deep understanding passing between the two women. She turned to her aide. "Pull up Specialist Sharma's full service record." Unredacted, a moment later, a tablet was in her hand. The colonel's eyes scanned the screen, and then she began to read aloud, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. The words fell like hammer blows on the ignorant assumptions that had filled the room moments before. Service record, Sharma, Anya. Rank held prior to administrative transfer, Sergeant. Unit, 75th Ranger Regiment. Military occupational specialty, Human Intelligence Collector, attached to Tier 1 strike teams. Combat deployments, 4. Kandahar. Helmand. The Karangal. She paused, letting the weight of those names sink in. Citations include the Bronze Star with Valor Device, the Combat Infantryman Badge, the Army Commendation Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. Rostova looked up from the tablet, her gaze sweeping over the trainees before landing squarely on Thorne, who had been allowed to get to his feet. She then turned back to Sharma, who had risen and stood at a perfect parade rest. Rostova came to a sharp, formal salute. "Sergeant Sharma," she said, her voice filled with a profound respect that shamed everyone else present. "Stand at ease." The story of what happened on the training mat spread through the base like wildfire. It was no longer a story about a specialist. It was the legend of Sergeant Sharma, the ghost of the mat. Trainees spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the day the quietest woman on base dismantled its loudest instructor with nothing more than precision and a legacy of quiet competence. The narrative shifted irrevocably. They no longer saw her height, they saw her skill. They no longer heard silence, they heard discipline. The humiliation changed Sergeant Major Thorne. His arrogance, shattered on that mat, was replaced by a hard-won humility. A week later, he approached Sharma not with an order, but with a request. "Sergeant," he said, his voice stripped of its usual bluster. "I was wrong. My assumptions were ignorant. Will you teach me?" It was the ultimate admission, a surrender of ego in the pursuit of genuine knowledge. Sharma simply nodded. She never once mentioned his mockery, never gloated. Her victory wasn't in his defeat, but in the opportunity to elevate the standards of everyone. Her agreement marked the beginning of a quiet revolution in the base's combat training. Sharma began holding unofficial sessions after duty hours. At first, only a few attended, mostly the soldiers who had been present that day. But word spread. They came to learn from the woman who had proven that technique was superior to mass, that precision was more devastating than power. She taught them to control their breathing, to use an opponent's aggression as a weapon, to find the fulcrum point in every engagement. She taught them the philosophy of the quiet professional, that true strength required no announcement, and that respect was a currency earned through action, not volume. The rubber training knife from that fateful day was eventually placed in a glass case inside the training facility's main office. Colonel Rostova herself wrote the inscription for the small brass plaque beneath it: "Leverage, strength." A reminder that assumptions are the enemy of readiness. It became a touchstone, a physical symbol of a lesson the entire installation was learning. Never judge a warrior by the length of their shadow. Months later, the impact of that single moment had become institutionalized. The base's entire close-quarters combat curriculum was officially rewritten. The new manual, co-authored by Sergeant Sharma and a now deeply respectful Sergeant Major Thorne, emphasized adaptability, biomechanics, and the neutralization of threats regardless of size disparities. The program became a model, studied by training commands across the force. New soldiers arriving for training were no longer greeted with lectures about brute force. Instead, they were told the story of Sergeant Sharma. Thorne himself was often the one who told it, using his own public failure as the program's most powerful teaching tool. He would stand before them and say, "I once looked at a soldier and saw only what I wanted to see. I measured her by her height and dismissed her. She taught me, and now I'm teaching you, to measure a soldier by their competence, by their discipline, and by the content of their character. Everything else is just noise." The legacy Sharma built was not one of personal vindication, but of collective improvement. Her quiet competence had created a ripple effect, elevating the skills and, more importantly, the mindset of hundreds of soldiers. She proved that true authority doesn't come from a rank on a collar or the volume of a voice, but from demonstrated excellence and the silent dignity of a professional. Her actions became a parable, a reminder that the most formidable people are often those who feel no need to announce their presence, for their skill speaks for them with a clarity that no words can ever match. It is a timeless lesson that in the arena of consequence, arrogance is a liability and competence is the only thing that matters. True legacy is not about the one moment you prove everyone wrong. It's about the lasting change you inspire, ensuring that the right lessons are carried forward long after you are gone. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.